Sally.
Hi, Kerry. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. I'm excited to be talking to you.
Welcome to Blogging Heads. Thank you so much for being on. I'm Kerry Howley, a contributing editor at Reason Magazine, and you are?
I'm Sally Haslanger. I'm a professor of philosophy and women's and gender studies at MIT.
Well, Sally, I'm so glad that you've agreed to be on. I thought we could have a conversation about your work and gender, and I will try not to get too far out of my depth, but if I don't know what you're saying, I'll just kind of smile and nod, and we'll move on.
Okay. All right. And if you don't understand what I'm saying, you say, Sally, that doesn't make any sense. You need to restate it in a way that I can understand it. That'll be fun.
Well, I'm actually experiencing a bit of the patriarchy right now because I have earbuds in my ears, and they're much too large for a lot of women, which I think it's proof that markets don't work, first of all. But so just to alert the commenters that I will have my fingers in my ears for the entire dialogue. So I thought we would start by talking about what gender is. You've said before that part of what you see as your role is kind of trying to explain what gender is. And I think I would say that gender is the social meaning of sex, but you have a much more interesting definition. So maybe you could tell us about that.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. So feminists have, for decades now, wanted to distinguish sex from gender. So sex is the physical body as differentiated by its reproductive function, so primary and secondary sex characteristics. And gender is going to be, as you point out, the social meaning of those physical differences. And cultures have interpreted those physical differences quite differently, had different theories of reproduction, etc., over time. And the way the body is marked, as well as what implications that had for the social structure, have really been quite variable. So gender isn't, as I see it, or as many feminists see it, a single thing that has been in place and is always in place across time and culture, but it's quite variable. And so when you say that gender is the social meaning of sex, there's a danger that you don't have a single thing. You've got many different things, and so it's not clear when we're talking about gender what we can say in general about it. So part of my work has been to try and articulate something that can give us a unified understanding of gender, but allow for the many differences there are in the way gender's lived and experienced across time and culture. And so as I see it, the best way to, so I'll try to be consistent in this. I'll use the term male and female to refer to bodies, and men and women to refer to genders. So when we're talking about women, say in a contemporary context, contemporary USA, our bodies are marked by certain kinds of dress and appearance and such like that. And then there are particular laws and institutional structures and expectations that come with an interpretation of someone as having a body of that type. So when I'm thinking about the broader phenomenon of gender, what I want to say is that gender across time and place is, the simple way to put it is, the social meaning of the marked body, the reproductively marked body, but that's not much more than gender's the social meaning of sex. But I think that men and women are a specific formation of this. So it's going to be a formation where the body marked as having female reproductive capacities is subordinated, and the body marked as having male reproductive capacities is privileged.
So then to be a woman is to be part of this subordinate class.
It's to be part of a subordinate class. Now, one way to think about that, and an example I've used a lot, is that, we think of, say, the categories of landlord and tenant. Those categories of landlord and tenant don't define everything about a person. They just define a particular role that the person plays in an economic structure. Likewise, what I think is that gender doesn't define the whole person. It just defines the role they play in a particular social structure. So to say that I'm a woman is to say that I'm viewed and treated a certain way within a particular structure. And what's common across history and culture is that people who are interpreted as having a certain kind of reproductive body are privileged, namely those who are interpreted as having a male reproductive body. Those who are interpreted as having a female reproductive body are subordinated. So that gives us men and women across time.
Okay.
And so I'm a woman, I'm in a subordinated class, but that's not to say everything about who I am. I mean, I'm not just a woman, just like someone is not just a landlord or just a tenant.
So you can still be in a position of immense social power. You can be, Queen Elizabeth.
Exactly.
But in some sense, you are still a part of a subordinate class?
Yeah, so I'm interested in the fact that, as Marilyn Frye has said, that even though you have many things going for you, like you might be in a inherited monarchy, you might be a monarch, and even though you have great wealth, etc., being a woman is something that you have that's going against you on the whole. And similarly for men, being a man, even if you are a poor black man who, has many other disadvantages, the fact that he's a man is something that he has going for him.
Okay.
So it's not to say that overall all women are worse off than all men or anything like that, because it's clearly not true.
So how does this account for the constraints that men face, sort of socially determined by their own gender expectations? So the little boy who's really interested in musical theater, does this account for the social roles that he's expected to play that might not be, of his choosing?
Well, I think it explains some things, but not everything. Okay. So I think that the positions in musical theater or in some of the other interests that he might have that are interpreted as feminine, those are going to be, on the whole, devalued compared to the roles and such that are considered masculine. Okay. And so, given that he is a male and he's going to be trying to occupy a social role that is interpreted as feminine, suitable for women, he's going to get a lot of backlash, right? Because he's not appropriately following the norms that are expected for someone who's interpreted to have a certain kind of body, a male body. And especially if he's going to give up some of his power, give up some of his authority as a male to go into that situation, he's going to get backlash for that. I think, one of the complicated cases is when you have someone who is so feminized that they're kind of treated as a woman. And they start where people start to see them as sexual objects, or they start to see them as people who are not deserving of positions of power and such like that. And I think that one can, in those sorts of situations, cease to be fully a man, but not yet become a woman. So there's this middle ground where you can say, so the example in one of my papers is where you have a black man who is beaten by the police, say, or beaten up by another group, where it seems like they're trying to take away, and he's getting this special horrific treatment, particularly because he's a black man. Then it looks like, well, wait a minute, they wouldn't treat a woman that way. He's being disadvantaged because he's a man. And what does that mean? Well, I'm inclined to say, yes, in that case, he's being feminized. He's being treated as if he's not a man, made to be sort of no longer manly. But that doesn't mean he becomes a woman. He just becomes a kind of feminized man in that situation. But it's tricky. Or a demasculinized man, or a demasculinized person, or something like that. Does that make sense?
Sure. So I'm wondering, to conceive of gender in this way, is this meant to be purely descriptive, Or is there a purpose? Is this meant to bring about a time when perhaps these subordinate classes don't exist, and instead of having men and women who are by definition part of this hierarchy, we instead have simply males and females?
Well, great question. I'm engaged in a theoretical project, and I think a lot of the feminists who are working in this tradition are as well. So we're not trying to analyze what everybody means by man and woman. We're not trying to say this is what's in people's heads when they think man and woman. We're trying to theorize how to understand these social classes, where there are women and there are men, and they function differently socially, and they have different rights and privileges, or seem to. And so we're trying to theorize that. And so this is the term gender is a kind of theoretical construct. And I am using it for a particular purpose. I want to have an understanding, going back to the beginning, of in whose name feminism speaks, or who is the subject that feminists are concerned to liberate, emancipate, etc., seek justice for. And as I mentioned before, if you see gender as something that is very heterogeneous, is different in very different times and places and cultures, it was beginning to seem as though there wasn't anything holding women together. There wasn't anything that feminism could fight for, no group. And so what I was doing was trying to say, no, there is a group that feminism fights for. It's a group of women across time and history, etc. And these are those people whose bodies are interpreted as having a certain reproductive capacity, and then they're disadvantaged as a result of that. And so this is the group that feminists are fighting for. And then the question is, well, how do we fight? Right? What's our goals? I think that's part of what you're saying. And I'm saying, well, I look for a day when there will be no more men and women, because being a man or being a woman is connected to a social hierarchy. And I don't believe this is a good thing, this social hierarchy. And so I want to do away with the social hierarchy. And if we do, then there will be no more men and women. There will be males and females, but there will not be men and women.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find that immensely appealing, just not only as a feminist, but I think as a libertarian, because this idea that your anatomy determines your sort of assignation to a group that's not of your choosing is clearly freedom constraining. It prevents self-authorship in a really important way. So I'm wondering what this world looks like. Is it blind to anatomical difference?
Well, to start with, I don't think we can be gender blind. But you're asking for those. So in order to get to a place where there are no men and women, I think that we have to be sensitive to the disadvantages that men and women, the disadvantages that women have faced and the privileges that men have had, because we have to identify them and try and eradicate them. And so the middle term is not going to be gender blind, or sex blind. But in the long term, I think that there's going to be more blindness than we have now. But it's my view that any just society where human beings reproduce sexually, so that it's not that we have test tube babies, we're going to need to have some recognition of reproductive difference, not just because we have to be able to tell, who's donating the sperm and who's donating the eggs, but because pregnancy, I think, is a burden. It's also a joy for many people, but it's a physical burden. It places physical constraints on the body that are different than what ejaculation does, right? Men can reproduce just by ejaculating, but women have a much greater burden to bear. And so I think that a just society must recognize that difference. But
in what way? Would that involve, say, subsidizing childbirth or supporting women through their pregnancy?
Yeah, it could be support. I think that women are capable of working through pregnancy. Different pregnancies are different, of course. But I think that there will be, time off around a birth that should go to both men and women. But there's going to be medical costs that women would have to bear that I think that should be subsidized. I think that there should be, for example, places and spaces for breastfeeding or just to accommodate the needs of lactating women. And one way that other cultures have done something like this is they've had, say, 4 genders, where I interpret it as 4 genders. So they had prepubescent children, boys and girls, what we think of as boys and girls, but for that culture it was just the very young. Then there were males and females of childbearing age, and then there were the elderly who were kind of past childbearing age, especially women past that age, and so the elders. So it wasn't that you had to have men and women as we know them starting from birth and going to death. And I think also even during childbearing years, we need to make it more complicated. I personally have 2 children, but have never given birth. I adopted 2 children, and so my relation to mothering and to parenting is different in some ways than a biological mother's would be.
I think I would have concerns that in a world in which the state is in some way supporting but subsidizing childbirth, it's hard for me to separate that from the idea that the state is incentivizing women to use their body in a particular traditional way that has traditionally been a role of subordination.
I agree. But then think of it the other side is suppose you are pregnant and you're a single mother, and it isn't clear to me that you shouldn't be given some accommodations in the workplace or some financial assistance because otherwise you're going to be disadvantaged by being the person who's going to have to bear the costs of that, but the benefits of that are to the whole society. I mean, I sometimes say to people who complain about parental benefits is, well, my son is going to be the person possibly who takes care of you, who's your doctor in your old age. And, you want him to get a good education. You want him to have health care. You want all these things because he is the next generation who's coming up, and he will have so much to offer to society. And so for me to have to bear the disadvantages that might come with pregnancy and lactation, whatever it is, that's nonetheless going to benefit lots of people. Other than me, I think that that's somewhat unfair as well.
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to whether the choice to bear children is a choice like other choices. So, I would worry for moving away from that. What does it mean if it's not a choice you fully made as an individual? Is it a choice you made? Is it a responsibility, a duty you have to the society? Because that's, again, classifying them by their anatomy in a place that they might not want to be.
Right, I don't think it's... I mean, I actually have kind of bizarre views on this because I have adopted children, and I do think that there are moral issues around who is raising the children who are currently in foster care and in group homes, and what do we owe to give those children genuine opportunities in their lives. And I don't assume that being a parent is a choice that's just about reproduction. A choice to parent isn't a choice necessarily to reproduce. So there are a wonderful, huge number of important questions here. I think you're right that we shouldn't say that it's anyone's moral obligation to produce a child. In fact, there's interesting philosophical research these days saying that we have moral obligations not to produce children. And I wouldn't want anyone thought to be, their goals and their objectives questioned because they don't include parenting as part of it. I mean, for many, many years, I was completely opposed to becoming a parent, thought I didn't want to be a parent, and hated the kind of culture of coupledom and the family basis of our society and such like that. So I agree with you completely that shouldn't become a basis for evaluating people. It shouldn't be something that's expected or is a norm. But I just worry, and so all I'm trying to suggest is that if it is something that is chosen, that and it's going to be chosen by two people, as long as we're reproducing sexually, that the female not be burdened in ways that are more substantial than the way that the male is burdened. So
maybe this is about distributing the burden amongst two people rather than the entire society.
Yeah, it will be, but the distributing a burden between two people, it's going to be difficult because if we want to give people the freedom to reproduce, even though they're not, the freedom to reproduce. People are going to reproduce whether they have the money to afford it or not. And so we don't want to say, have forced abortions or forced, processes which take children away from their biological parents. I think that we're going to say, okay, here are two people. They have to have health care. They have to have opportunities to work, to have their jobs kept for them. They have to have, time off to spend time with a child in their earliest days in order for that child to be, brought into a nurturing environment. So how are we going to do that when maybe neither of them have the resources to do that, where maybe the male could just carry on, working his job and doing his thing, but the female couldn't because, I just want to make sure that women as a group are not systematically disadvantaged by finding themselves in that situation.
Mm-hmm. You brought up your two children, and you've written about the experience of mothering two children of a different social race, and I was wondering if you might talk a little bit about how they've expanded your conception of what it is to be a subordinated social race in America.
Oh, it's been a very profound experience. Both of my children are black, and they're both were born in this country, one in Michigan and one in Texas. And with both families, we have open adoption, so I know the biological families of both the children, have ongoing contact with them. And so there's two, many different dimensions of this, but one dimension is just being with my children and experiencing the world as parents often do through the eyes of their children, and coming to occupy that position in a social environment where I am identifying with my child and trying to see the world as they see it. And it's required me to go through huge personal changes in understanding my identity and my whiteness and my community, who are the people I'm close to, who I care about, who I spend time with. And I think it's also been very powerful because we know the extended families and spend time with them to come to see their struggles and their challenges, some of which are clearly related to class. My husband and I are relatively affluent, and they are definitely not. We have many privileges that they don't have. But because class and race are so intertwined in this country, and the challenges of getting out of a disadvantaged class situation the challenges are multiplied by being black, I think I have a much better appreciation of their struggles. So it's really been an eye-opening experience, a very deep experience of, kind of grief and sadness for the structures that have oppressed African Americans, but there's also this incredible joy at finding communities of people. We go to a black church, African Methodist Episcopal Church, and the people in that church have made such a difference to me in my life because of their support for me and their acceptance of me and their ways in which they've helped me with my children.
Mm-hmm. You've written about how you've had to become cognizant of this whole other set of norms in kind of dressing your children. You had to learn how they would be judged. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, completely. So it's, I mean, I'm going to be a little oversimplifying, but in the black community, I think compared to the kind of hippie white community that I came out of, how you appear, if you appear dressed nicely in ironed clothing, means different things. So if you are, I mean, again, if I were parenting my own biological child, I wouldn't really care what they wore. I mean, they could wear anything they wanted, and I would never press their clothes. I mean, forget it. Why bother to iron someone's clothes? I mean, that seems kind of dopey. But if you see that, if you are aware of there being cultural expectations about black children as being dirty or poor or unable to care for themselves and such, you begin to see that it's an important part not only of self-respect but a signaling to a broader white community that no, these are children who are well groomed, well cared for, their clothes are pressed, their hair is nicely done, and they're not just running around looking like, I don't know, street rats, or the way that a white person might view a black child. And so I think that I've come to appreciate why those norms are there, but it's also been that now, like, for example, if my daughter's hair is not done and it doesn't look good, I feel really self-conscious and anxious. So, what's someone going to think about her? Are they going to, if she goes to church with her hair not done nicely, then I feel anxious that people are going to think I'm not taking good care of her. So there's...
Right, because that appearance pulls in all of these assumptions that we might not associate with a slovenly appearance in a child, but that community would.
Yeah, that community would, but also that community rightly understands that the white community is looking for markers of many different things in the black community. So again, this goes back to the marking. I mean, we haven't really talked about race, but I have a parallel analysis of race to analysis of gender. And I think that that color, in scare quotes, because I think it's not just skin color, but many different features, are markers that signal a sort of ancestry to a particular geographical region. And so when the body is marked as a black body, there's going to be a whole bunch of assumptions and norms and that kick in. And in the marking of the black body, I think that there are kind of very subtle cues and markers that white people and others look for about, is this a poor black person? Is this an educated black person?
Is this somebody I need to fear?
Is this someone I need to fear? Is this someone from Africa or someone from from African American? How do I treat them? And so what you need to do, I mean, and all of us do this all the time, is choose our clothes and sort of model ourselves, sort of adjust our appearance to give the kinds of markers that are important to situate us socially, where we need to or want to be. And so that, I think, those clothing markers become really more significant for black children because there's a whole lot more at stake. I mean, if my hippie white kids went to school looking, ridiculous and kind of mismatched clothes, I mean, people would think, or dirty, unpressed, people would think, oh, free thinkers, they've got bohemian free thinker parents or something like that. And that wouldn't mean anything.
It's almost counter-signaling. They're so wealthy they can dress their kid this way.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, how creative, or how, iconoclastic, or anything like that. Where if I send my kids in those clothes, my actual kids in those clothes, I'm just not sure what they're going to think. And I have seen, many, many occasions where, I mean, my son, when he was in preschool, there was a program produced to introduce prospective parents to the preschool. And what were there? There were 16 kids in the classroom, and this was a slideshow, and my son wasn't in a single one of them except for a couple of group shots. No, and they had pictures. They had a little assignment where teachers asked students questions that were like, "What's the moon made of?" Here they're preschoolers, so cream cheese. What is it made of? And they would have 6 kids answer each question, and they had 10 questions up there. My son was not asked a single one of those questions. His name did not appear on a single one of those sheets of paper. And I was saying, why aren't you putting his picture in the slideshow? Why aren't you asking him questions? He's beautiful. He's smart. I couldn't understand it. And who knows what it was? Could have been an accident. Could have been, but I have to raise the hypothesis that it's because he's black. That it's because he wasn't, his point of view on what the moon was made of wasn't really valued.
Wow.
So then when you see systematically things like this happening, then you start thinking, what can I do to make sure that my children are not marked as being, the one, in a way that's going to disadvantage them systematically. Right. And so that's why things like dress, and I think it's true for girls too.
Completely. I sense in the press and among feminists this frustration that anyone would ever talk about what women are wearing, women politicians, for instance. And I think that misses how immensely important it is to be able to present markers that people associate with authority, which is difficult for women. For men it's easy. I show up in a nice suit. But we can see how difficult it is to navigate because, obviously Hillary Clinton's never been very good at it. And to just kind of shove that under the rug when everyone is receiving these like high fidelity signals, it seems like until we get to the point where clothes don't matter, it's immensely important for women to learn how to address in an authoritative way.
Oh, I completely agree. I have a good friend who's also a woman of philosophy of my generation, and we used to laugh that when we were invited to give a fancy talk, we'd never seen a woman do it, or maybe only one woman ever do it. And so we spent more time worrying about what we were going to wear than we worried about the title of our talk, the subject matter of our talk. And in
some sense it might matter just as much. For how people perceive you at the end, as sad as that is.
And also it's really pathetic. My husband, who's also a philosopher who gives talks, he can go and give a talk in a pair of jeans and a t-shirt. Sure. He usually wears a button-down shirt, but he typically wears jeans, not very nice jeans, not like designer jeans or anything like that, and a button-down shirt. I could never get away with that. Yeah. That would, I just wouldn't happen. Though I have to tell you a funny story about dress and women philosophers. There's a wonderful, a woman, Elizabeth Anscombe, who's a famous woman of us, the generations ahead of me. And she, smoked a cigar. She had 6 children or something, lots of children. She was a very iconoclastic woman. And she went to a restaurant once with a group of men, philosophers. And the maitre d' said to her, I'm sorry, ma'am, you may not enter into the restaurant. You can't come in to have dinner at our restaurant wearing pants. And she said...
When was this?
Oh, that's no problem. And she took her pants off.
When was this?
I don't know. I'm imagining in the 40s or something. I see. Sure. I'd have to figure it out. But, I think that's the right attitude sometimes.
Yeah, completely. I have a friend who just kind of ripped all her clothes off at airport security in protest. So, you want to pat me down? Fine. I'm just going to stand here in my bra and see how you react. And, of course, they were horrified. Well, you have written before about this, about the way women philosophers are treated. I'm wondering, do you think there's something specific about the discipline of philosophy that makes it difficult for women to break in?
Well, again, we don't know enough about this sort of thing. I've got some speculations. I wish I knew more. I do think that there's much recent research on implicit bias, unconscious bias, that is potentially relevant here. On this new research, it's not that people have conscious beliefs that women are not good philosophers or women don't belong in philosophy or anything like that, but that they carry with them schemas about what a philosopher is and does and looks like, and that these schemas are simplifying assumptions, which we all rely on. I mean, all kinds of schemas we rely on, couldn't do without.
Right. But so it's just a result of kind of pattern recognition. Every philosopher I've seen has looked like this.
Yeah. And all the books with all the philosophers with the beards and the pipes and the things like this. This is just a pattern that is developed, and I've come to expect the pattern. And then what happens is that if they start seeing things that don't fit the pattern, they seem deviant or wrong or inferior or problematic. And so there are ways in which we try to sort of adjust the evidence to correspond to the schema. Instead of adjusting the schema, I mean, eventually you can get people to adjust the schema to accommodate the evidence. But the first sort of thing that happens is that people start denying that she really is a philosopher. She's not really a philosopher. She has, she's smart and she does work in sort of this related area, but she's not really a philosopher. So that would avoid having to adjust the schema. Or you could say, she's a philosopher, but she's not a good philosopher, or something like that.
And just to clarify, these are reactions that women as well as men are having.
Yes, definitely. And so in the research on implicit bias, it's been found that women and men are just as prone to implicit bias. That women are just as prone to implicit bias as men. And in race, that racial minorities are as prone to implicit bias as majority groups. Because again, it's when you have, as you were pointing out, lots and lots of evidence in your limited experience about what things of this type do look like, then you bring that to your future experience. So it's like saying, well, whales, they're kind of weird mammals. They're not really mammals, are they? When you first see a whale, you don't think it's a mammal. You have to be told it's a mammal, etc. And so they're outliers of mammals because, and so likewise, women and minorities are outliers in philosophy, and so there's a tendency to devalue them and their work. And so that's a problem, but not consciously. I mean, no one's saying, that we all still have these conscious biases. It's all very, very implicit. And so the challenge
and therefore more insidious. It's not just one discriminatory man at the top of this hierarchy. It's something that even the women in the program have directed toward other women.
Yeah, definitely. And even people who are consciously, actively trying to combat these effects can find that they themselves fall into it sometimes. So I've been doing, at MIT, I've been giving presentations to all the search committees in my school, and I'm going to be doing some more in the School of Science to try and alert people to the effects of implicit bias. And there are a few things that you can do. One is that being aware of implicit bias as a problem so that you have metacognition that, reflects on your decisions and reflects on your process and reflects on all of that, gives it a second look. Those sorts of things can be useful. Taking more time. These schemas tend to kick in when you're rushed, when you have to make a decision without sufficient information, when there's ambiguity in the evidence. So they typically come in when you can't take the time and effort to really look carefully. But how search committees work, when you're trying to hire somebody, you don't have time to read all those folders as thoroughly as you'd like to. And so that's exactly a place where these schemas have an effect.
Yeah. So I would assume that the best way to combat implicit bias, there's a chicken and egg problem here, that would be to have more female philosophers, or have more of whatever the underrepresented group is, so that you could change the pattern. Is that right?
Well, it does look like that's an important thing to do. It doesn't help with just one or two usually.
Oh, really?
You need to get. I mean, it seems like the areas where women are underrepresented, really, there's a huge turnaround when the representation of women is 25 to 30%. And there are a number of different reasons why you need more than just a couple. One is that, it's like, oh, my best friend is an ex, right? That even the most entrenched schemas or stereotypes or biases can allow for exceptions. And so you might say, oh, well, Sally, she's an exception. Like, she's not like other women or whatever like that. And so you need, and it's also the case that if you have a very small number of women in a setting where they are historically underrepresented, their experience can be very negative. And so they might not perform up to their full potential because they're combating all kinds of problems. Let's put it that way. And there's still also a problem of not having a sufficient variety of women, so that even if one woman makes it, she might be able to open the door to women who are kind of like her, but we come in many different shapes and sizes and styles and ways of thinking, et cetera, and so it doesn't necessarily open the door to the huge diversity of women that there are. But that's not to say that it shouldn't be done. I mean, if we can get a significant number of women into these areas where women are underrepresented, it can make a huge difference. And I think the same sort of thing is true of minorities. I mean, I don't think there's good enough research on right now, or not that I know of, is what is the critical mass for minorities. If the critical mass for minorities is going to be 25 to 30%, that's going to be, it's going to be hard to achieve that in the near
because
future.
If they're not that proportion of the population, then that's going to be, they're going to have to be vastly overrepresented to even get a fair shake.
Yes, exactly. And then also there's going to be questions about, well, does it help if it's any minority? So do you need 25 to 30% of any minority at all? Or in order to really to break down the biases and the schemas against African Americans, you have to have 25 to 30% of African Americans. I mean, that would be, so this is, I think, an area where there may be recent research on that I haven't seen, but I think that more needs to be done.
That's really interesting, and that relates in a very obvious way to the election we're about to have. Do you think that Obama will be seen as an exception? As he's, there are always outliers and just kind of doesn't really change the conception in a way some of us might have hoped?
Well, I think it's hard to say. I think he has been both advantaged and disadvantaged by his own personal history, his background. He's, I think, been seen by some people as not really black. He's been seen by some people as kind of an outlier, and which makes him more acceptable. I do think, though, that it will make a difference because, having someone who identifies as black, who is very connected to the black community, who has, a black family, who's involved in a black church, and all of those, in a position such as president, can potentially have a huge impact in beginning to change a schema, to adjust a schema.
One could make the argument that that's more important than any particular policy, which I think it upsets people, but to say it is perfectly okay to vote for a minority or a female president because they will upset the schema. But if it does have this transformative effect, even in a small way, I think that's a perfectly good reason to vote.
Yeah, well, I think it's one of the good. I mean, it's a consideration, certainly. And there are moments when I get really excited because I think, this could this could really make a difference, just him being there. I mean, sometimes I think about women, just get our bodies there in front of the philosophy classroom. Just get our bodies there, on the podium and with speaking articulately and speaking knowledgeably. I mean, that image can really make a difference, and I completely agree with that.
Have you seen a change since you have started in philosophy departments? Do you think acceptance has grown and the expectation of what a philosopher ought to look like has changed?
I think so. I mean, I definitely think so. I think that things were tolerated when I started in philosophy that wouldn't be tolerated anymore. Things that male faculties used to say to female grad students, or ways that junior faculty women would be treated, that's just not tolerated anymore.
Okay.
And I think that in our department, there are quite a few women graduate students. On the whole, I'm a little discouraged because, it's been decades now, and we're not seeing the kinds of changes that I would have hoped. And I'm not sure why, and we're just trying to figure that out at this point. And that's what some of the work on schemas is trying to do, is there something, because we've convinced a lot of people that we've gotten them to change their beliefs about what women are capable of and where women belong and things like that. But it's still not changing the culture to the degree that we would like to, and it's not making it hospitable to women to the extent that we would like to. And so that's how the interest in schemas has arisen. I think women do self-select. I think it's a very kind of tough environment, and if especially women coming into it, they've got other choices. They can do well in law school or in business or in philosophy. It's not like they're going to make huge amounts of money or be famous or anything like that. And so if they're considering going into an environment that's somewhat hostile, then I think that many of them would just say it's not worth it.
Yeah, I experienced this somewhat being a political reporter in D.C. It's an extremely heavily male population, and I really don't think it's based on this kind of overt cartoonish discrimination. It's based on the fact that people aren't self-selecting in. I mean, most magazines of any sort of political nature get far, far fewer submissions from women. But, of course, that doesn't really answer. I mean, that just suggests that the problem is even more deep-rooted. Are women being socialized not to be competitive, not to be, not to have strong opinions of the sort that might be published on, Slate or something? And then the problem becomes so big, it's hard to sometimes know what to do with it.
I completely agree. I think it's very hard and very, very tricky how to break in and both working for both sides. So part of what I'm interested in is, instead of saying these are the bad guys and these are the innocent, and it's a battle between them, is saying, look, we all need to change. Women need to change the way they think about themselves and the way they think about each other. Men need to change the way they think about themselves and the way they think about women, and it's not just changing our beliefs, because this is one of the things that I think is so interesting about schemas and about social practices and social structures, is that it's how we even move around each other and make eye contact with each other, and it's very unconscious. And I think, that's why getting the bodies into the places and saying, okay, now I am on the podium and you are down there and I am speaking to you and you have to look up to me.
Yeah.
That these sorts of things can make a difference. Because it's not that I'm trying to change your belief, but I'm trying to change your comportment in relation to me. And by changing your comportment in relation to me, then, maybe you will sort of bring with it a different kind of openness to what I'm saying, or a different kind of attention to what I'm saying, or things like that. And I don't think it's always going from, we're driven by our beliefs. I think that our beliefs are sometimes changed by just having to encounter a new experience of a woman in this position, or reading an article by a woman that sounds, it's ridiculous. There are these things that are written, and these tests about language and who speaks like a woman and speaks like a man, who writes like a woman and writes like a man. And there was that you can submit pieces of writing and then it will
I've done that, and
it.
I came out, it was like there was a 2% chance I was a woman. I was like, what is that?
Yeah,
mean?
I know. I'm like that too. I get this like, oh, I write like a man. And it's like, what do you mean I write like a man? I mean, who? Wait a minute. I mean, is this just a statistical that, the majority of... I don't know what it means. And it also makes it seem as though, if I'm writing that way and people then see that the person behind that writing is me, then they're going to have to change their attitudes, I think.
That's a great point.
So...
Yeah, I mean, I have an interesting experience with this because I have a somewhat androgynous name. And I do tend to write in a way that I guess is stereotypically male, where there'll be like a very strong idea that's, pushed in a very assertive way. And and this hasn't changed throughout my career, but most of the positive mail I get back is addressed to Mr. Howley.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. And, I don't know what that says, but I think that if I weren't writing about the subjects which I write about, there wouldn't be this confusion, because most people don't associate the name Kerry immediately with a man, I don't think. But
That's
if
right.
it's, a libertarian writing about topics in a sort of logic-driven way, you get the, like, Dear Mr. Howley, I liked your piece, which is, it's an interesting experience.
Definitely.
Well, thank you so much, Shelley, for coming on and sharing some of your insights with us. I hope we can do this again sometime.
Yeah, I'd love to, and I'd love to have an opportunity to talk about some of your ideas and to talk about, libertarianism in the context of gender and race and issues like that. I think that would be tremendously fun. So
let's do that next time then.
We've got to start, so
yes.
We'll go and move on from there.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye.